What is up, internet people? It is Wednesday night. It is 7 o'clock p.m. It's time to talk some shit. So, what's up? I hope you got your whatever you need ready. A little beer, a little blunt, a little notepad, whatever you got. So, this episode is talking about winning races and going fast. I've said many times that I come from a racing family and we're all about going fast, and that's the real deal. And I just want to give a shout out to my cousin Kirk. That's this guy right here. He's the car chief for the number 2, Austin Cindric. They just won the Daytona 500, fam. That's pretty cool. So I'm dead serious about that shit. I'm here to win races. 2 of my cousins, which are like brothers, we grew up very tight, have been in NASCAR since like 2001, I think it is. Kirk, who's in this photo, was the crew chief for Robbie Gordon for a while. He spent a lot of time with Kevin Harvick. There's some really cool family memories of my cousin being on the cover of USA Today from getting in fights with Kevin Harvick. He hasn't gotten any fights in a while, but family's down to scrap. So what's up? So I wanted to try and correlate, honestly, just commemorate the homie for winning the damn Daytona 500. That's a pretty big deal. And we've been working at those goals our entire lives. And I've taken that same idea of racing and how we approached racing into our cannabis cultivation, and really any cultivation for that matter. And there's a lot of similarities in the way that we approach the cultivation space now as how we approached racing when we were younger. And I was the youngest of the bunch, so my job was always taking tire temperatures, logging track times. And so every time we went to the racetrack, we would compile a tremendous amount of data and statistics about our process, about the race cars. We would keep track of these. We would keep track of weather, track temperatures, time of day, and we would refer back to those down the road into the future when we would come back to that racetrack or when we were at the same local racetrack. And we've taken that same exact approach into our consulting, and we are huge advocates of taking data sets to help you in your process so that you can discern what it is that is happening and where you are actually going and what the actual goal is. And so as a kid growing up, when we were racing go-karts or dirt bikes or stock cars, it didn't really matter. We took the same process. We measured the setup of the car. We took tire temperatures after the hot laps. We took track times. And at the end of the race, we would sit down and we would collate all this data and try to make sense of it. And plain and simple, we whooped ass in everything that we raced. We won track championships in different car classes and different activities. When we raced go-karts, we whooped ass. When we raced Baja 500, we whooped ass. And same thing's going on in cannabis. We're whooping some ass. And so the goal is to try and get you all up to date with what it takes to have fast growth rates, good yields, and frankly, enjoyable outcomes in living soil. And there's some pretty considerable contextual understandings that need to go on with regards to living soil in order to have success. I think one of the most important things is context, right? So in order to have truth, you need the content, which is the subject matter, to line up with the context, which is the scenario or the governing environment around the scenario. Otherwise, it's not true. And so an example would be in various cocoa strategies. It is imperative that you have wet-dry cycles. So for the context of cocoa, the truth is that full, complete wet-dry cycles are essential. So the content of the statement is wet-dry cycles are appropriate. The context is in a cocoa core drained away situation, that is imperative. Now, if you come into a living soil situation, that is not true. That is actually maybe one of the more detrimental things you might do. So in that situation, the content, which is wet-dry cycles are imperative in the context of living soil, permanent soils, environments, that context is not in alignment with that content, and that statement is not true. And I think this is the hardest part for those of you that are moving from other areas of cultivation or other cultivation styles and techniques and moving into the living soil world. If you're a salt-based grower and you have not yet moved into living soil or have plans to move into living soil, you are going to go the way of the dinosaurs. I promise you that. So if you are considering or toe dipping, I would not wait, because there's going to be a limited time for everybody to get on board with where the world is going. And it is undeniably going to be the primary cultivation choice widespread here in the next few years. I would say that's undeniable. And I'm saying that from personal experience, because we've worked with famous hydroponic growers, we've worked with famous living soil growers, we've worked with not famous people and everything in between. And I can tell you where the market is absolutely moving, undeniable. It doesn't matter who you are as a salt-based cultivator. We can take a complete novice grower, set them up on the correct components to that system, and they will smash every aspect of the salt-based cultivator's quality parameters, from frost, from potency, smell, flavors. It is not even comparable. Now, in the case of doing living soil inappropriately or with some out of context situations, then yeah, no, that's not going to outperform the top in the hydroponic community. And so my goal today is to try and give you some insight into what is needed to outperform those salt-based cultivators, or outperforming the results you may have had in other salt-based cultivation techniques, or even organic cultivation techniques, because those aren't the same. So if you're doing organic bottles, again, in cocoa or small containers, that is not what you want to be doing for living soil. And so, we got Wesley banging his head on the wall with peat moss, peat base. Yeah, so I'm not a fan of peat moss based soil. Some people are. That's one thing we can maybe start with, is the soil. Soils, containers, that's extremely important in living soil. There's a lot of people that are using, would be more like a soilless media, so like a pro mix, something that's mostly a mixed media, not a soil. And in the case of living soil, hopefully you are focusing on some aspects of biology, and biology needs organic matter to survive on. So if you are using a pro mix base or something like that, you are going to have to feed a considerable amount of nutrition very frequently to get even half of the results of somebody that has a soil with a proper ratio of compost to other components in that system. And the compost itself is fairly important. We see a lot of soils that are made with marine life based composts, and we see some significant issues with a value on the Logan soil test called exchangeable hydrogen, which starts to significantly disrupt the base saturation ratios of that soil and tends to acidify the soil, and in certain situations can be a total disaster. In other situations, it can work just fine, but it is something that you need to know, and you need to measure, and you need to know where you're at. Because if you are using one of those soils and you already have an elevated exchangeable hydrogen value, and you're saying adding a lot of fish hydrolysate or something else for that, then you're going to be elevating that value, and then it's going to be very problematic. So having an appropriate soil is essential. Most of the living soil community is working off a third mix, which is a Cornell University deal that was popularized by Clackamas Coot. And that's perfectly fine mix, and that's where I started. The Coot mix specifically needs significant work from a mineral composition standpoint, but that's starting to iron itself out in the market, and you're seeing other retailers expand upon his original principles and make it a more appropriate mineral balanced type soil. So I started with that same exact mix and had decent results. It still produced fantastic quality, but we never stopped there. We continue to evolve. I then later met a guy that was doing cocoa-based living soil, so subbing out the peat moss for the cocoa core, and that was a significant improvement in growth rates. The speed was significantly better that way. Peat moss tends to waterlog and also be hydrophobic, so it's kind of a bit of an asshole. And but it can work in certain situations, right? So context is very important. If you're in a full sun, full term scenario, that full cocoa mix is going to use a lot of water. It's going to be fairly unforgiving, and in that situation, it's probably not the most ideal. So I found that, especially with the people that we're working with, when I started selling a soil that was 1/3 cocoa, 1/3 compost, 1/3 aeration, the growth rates were fantastic, but it's fairly unforgiving for novice growers. So we started substituting in some peat moss with the cocoa coir into that 1/3 of the component of the soil mix. And depending on your context, the ratio of peat moss to cocoa coir will determine which direction you go and various factors. So the more cocoa coir you go, the more aerated it's going to be, the better the water is going to infiltrate. But in certain situations, it can be fairly unforgiving with the blue mat systems. And so all these contextual situations need to come into play. Most importantly, that soil needs to have adequate mineral nutrition and appropriate mineral balance. And that's a really debated topic right now by the various agricultural advisors. And there's a lot of division amongst the ranks of what those goals are. And as a person that commonly bails people out during catastrophic crop loss, everything that I teach is based off of watching the other failings of those other advisors. And so I make my advice based on what we've seen actually work for farmers long term. So I am a big advocate of doing frequent testing, and maintaining the mineral balance of that soil is extremely important. And so we prefer to use Logan Labs. The reason why I use Logan Labs is the type of testing they do, which is the Malic 3, which was developed by Dr. William Albrecht. And I do still believe that that is the most appropriate soil test for the context of living soil. Whether you're in native soils or potting soils, I still believe that most of your decisions should be based off of the Malic 3. Logan also produces the saturated paste test, which indicates what is currently water soluble. I think that's a good test to keep in track. And I use the saturated paste test to govern what direction I'm going with amendment choices as far as water soluble or fairly insoluble. And a lot of my counterparts are really pushing the idea that the Malic 3 test is inaccurate. I will stand till my day of death that that is not correct. And the Malic 3 is plenty accurate when you take into consideration that the variation in that soil test is actually coming from the soil blending process. And so there tends to be fairly wildly varied reports on the Malic 3 test when a given farm will do multiple tests. That very literally is indicating the variation amongst your soil mix, and I will stand true that that needs to be addressed. And when we see farms that are working solely off of the saturated paste test, you're always a week or two behind, and they're always chasing the yield. So I don't think that that's really a very solid strategy moving forward. And so just kind of to recap, you need an appropriate soil with the proper composition of materials, appropriate for the context of your situation, plenty of compost. In the regulated space, that needs to be clean compost, so free of heavy metals, pesticides, all that type of garbage. And you need to monitor that over time. You need to maintain that as if it is your bank account. When a farm comes to me that is having all hell break loose, which is really common in permanent soil situations, when we do a soil test, those base saturation targets are usually extremely dysfunctional. And when you take any of the available commercially produced products for dry mineral top dress, those products often cover the nitrogen component, the magnesium component, and the potassium component. And there's a little bit of calcium in there, but it's nowhere near the level of calcium that's needed to maintain ideal balance of the basic cations in that soil over time. And so there's a lot of fear about moving to a large volume of soil and moving to a permanent soil because pretty much every organic farmer has either experienced or has very direct association to someone who has experienced, often many times experienced, that harvest where all hell breaks loose and you have to scoop out the soil and throw it away. And what people don't understand is that is 100% to do with the entire community at large disregarding basic soil chemistry considerations and the management of soil chemistry over time. So when you use a dry mineral top dress product, regardless of who it's from, they're all fairly equal in benefit and they're all fairly equal in detriment, really. you will end up significantly deficient in calcium, extremely high in magnesium, and extremely high in potassium. And when those calcium to magnesium ratios in the soil fall out of balance, everything about the soil changes. The porosity changes, the water infiltration rates change, and the accessibility and the ability of the plant to get the adequate calcium goes down. 9.5 out of 10 times, that soil that you started with was nowhere near adequate levels of calcium. So most of the soils that you purchase are 10, 20, 30% low on a base saturation consideration, which might take doubling the calcium value to correct. And you're talking about significant deficits in calcium industry-wide, which I guess can kind of take us into our second consideration, which is container size. And for living soil, you really are benefited by going larger. And when we first started professional consulting for living soil farms in 2016, it was really common to be using 15 or 20-gallon pots. And even then, I said 20-gallon pot was too little. At kind of that 2016 era, I used to say that a 30-gallon pot was minimum. But then we started working in 20, 30, 40, 50, 60,000 square foot buildings loaded with 15 and 30-gallon pots. And you could stand up on a chair and look down at the canopy, and it looked like a topographical camouflage map. It was just like the variation was insane. And the problems were pretty widespread. And those farms were always chasing yield. Variation was significantly difficult to overcome. And most farms don't, to be point blank. A lot of the living soil farms, they come in, a lot of the commercial facilities, especially, there's an investor component and there's a cultivation component, and they have to work together to make these decisions to move forward. And there's almost always an apprehension on the part of the farmer and the part of the investor to commit to a large soil volume. The investor side doesn't want the financial burden. The cultivator usually doesn't know enough about soil chemistry to know how to keep themselves safe, and so they're apprehensive about committing to the soil volume that will ultimately benefit them. And so this is the big obstacle that we run into. And in the context of commercial farms, those farms that start out with 3, 5, 10, 15-gallon pots, their goal is to work up to beds, and the reality is most of them don't actually get there. Most of them go out of business fighting 5-gallon pots or 15-gallon pots or 20-gallon pots or 30-gallon pots. And there's been a good handful of situations where we've come in to help a large commercial farm that was working in 15 or 20 or 30-gallon pots, and we transitioned them even to a 4x8 bed. And those next yields, without changing much else, were typically double. So the real obstacle with that, though, is if I'm advocating committing to a large permanent soil, if you're paying attention to the last episode, I let you know that there's not a lot of good options for soil. And so that is a significant problem. A lot of the work we do with our professional clients is actually navigating them through a soil purchase. So I do a tremendous amount of preliminary testing. We make sure that soil is correct before we even ship it away from the soil facility, because it's a lot easier and cheaper to correct it at the soil facility if there's a significant issue than it is to pay for freight, have it show up to a farm, and turn out it's an absolute disaster. So I go through considerable lengths to make sure that the soils that we produce are as accurate as possible. Even with that, I still test mineral chemistry before it leaves the yard. By the time that soil gets to the farm, we've already calculated the corrections that need to be done to it. And then those corrections go to the final home once the soil's been moved into place. And if it's a large farm, we even then follow up again to make sure that we've done everything correctly. And so that's a whole lot more work than pretty much anybody else is doing. Nick Tomasini is the only person I know that is also doing that level of work with soil building for his clients. There's a couple other people that I think are doing a lot of work. I just think at this larger scale, a lot of the other advisors and consultants and whatnot are unaware to the degree to which these soils vary. And I think even they need to up their testing of their own process in order to indicate what the heck is going on. So soil is a considerable thing to manage, but it's your largest contributing component. And so the balance of that soil and the mineral composition of that soil is going to determine most of your outcome. And anything you're feeding on top of that soil is going to be amplified by the degree to which that soil is balanced and the volume of minerals in that soil. So there's a lot to consider there. As far as small containers, it's a common point to go to, and I understand why people go that route. I just have not really seen it pan out once. When you go to a smaller container in living soils, you're taking away a lot of the advantages that living soil in a bed or a larger container is actually affording you. And so one of the biggest obstacles with small containers or pots of any type is that it's really common in a soil batch to have a tote or two that is completely jacked from a mineral chemistry. It was either the first one through or the last one through, or the one right before lunch break or right after the smoke break, or it's pretty common to have a couple totes of soil in a batch that are just completely jacked. And so when you're filling pots individually from those totes, you're going to end up with 6, 10, 12, 20 pots from that tote that are all jacked on soil chemistry. And as a cultivator, you have in your mind that all that soil is exactly the same. And 100% of my experience shows that none of the soil is the same, even when tremendous amount of effort is gone into making that soil consistent. So one of the obstacles to large volume of soils is variation. And when you go into pots, you're penalized on that phenomenon. So there's a lot of decisions as far as why to go into pots. And one of the main arguments for pots is higher plant counts. People are flat out afraid of getting the yield, so they want to have the plant counts go up. We haven't had one situation where a farm went down in plant count into a larger soil volume and had a decrease in yield. I have not seen it happen once. So the yield always goes up when we move into a larger container. And so that larger container buffers the variation in the soil. So if you're filling a 12 or 20 foot bed with a tote of soil, if you get that one really dysfunctional tote, it just makes 2 inches of soil. It's not that big a deal. And so it buffers it out. But in pots, you get 10 to 20 pots that are a complete disaster. There's another argument for smaller pots that we want rolling benches. And the idea with rolling benches is maximizing canopy. And this is a business world consideration. And I don't see that play out one time to increase yield for the rolling benches. I've been advocating against rolling benches since 2016. I still stand that stance. I definitely do not advocate spending money on rolling benches. I'm definitely not a tiered stacking guy in flowering. I think that's not a good idea. And especially with living soil, what you need to do is just do ground level really well and completely, and you should not have to want for yield. With the new lighting enhancements, the yields that we're getting out of some of these brands are just absolutely unbelievable. And if you just give your cultivation space everything that it needs to be successful, you won't feel inclined to do, 6-tier racking garbage. Not a fan of any of that stuff. And with the rolling benches, all it does is maximize headache. It maximizes employee burnout. When we do our site visits, we will usually work with the employees for an entire day, and that will give us an indication as to the barriers to success and the obstacles that those farms are experiencing. And I have not been to a farm where those rolling benches moved well or where the employees enjoyed moving them. And at all of those facilities, we'll watch an employee going down an aisleway, and they'll look across a row and see that there's a problem, and they'll look to the left and they'll look to the right, and they'll see that they're by themselves and they got to move both these benches, and that plant could be like broken. I mean, something like legitimately needs to be dressed right now, and they just won't do it. And so you've maximized canopy at the expense of minimizing happiness, output, and effectiveness of your employees, which should be up at the top. And so the farms that we see putting that as a focus, then you can see that the yield and the profitability of those farms are up there. And so just kind of food for thought. Now, here's a consideration. Yeah. Now, in a veg room, yes, veg room needs pots. And in that case, you're best off doing the largest pot you can or spending the least amount of time in those pots. So you're starting to see the popularity of bottomless pots. That is definitely a good strategy. It solves a lot of problems in the living soil veg to flower transition. We just designed a new pot. We will be launching it here in the next week or so. Keep an eye out for that. I'm not ready to do it today, but we just received our first shipment of the new batch, and we're pretty damn excited. And yeah, that's for sure. New lights are definitely putting out 2 grams a watt or more. We just had a cultivator that is on his first harvest cycle ever in a tent, pull 1.5 grams per watt out of a tent on a light turn to 50%. So the new era of lighting is just unbelievable, and we need to evolve the other aspects of living soil to what the lighting companies are doing. And so we've done that level of evolution. It's just not very widespread. Kind of the funny part about my journey is that very few of the farms that we've catapulted to success have mentioned much about what they're doing, and a lot of them continue to keep that a secret, which I don't fault or have any issue with. It's just kind of a funny thing. And so most of the market at Wide doesn't really know about the results that we are getting, and which is why we got this show, right? So we're starting to be YouTube content creators like the rest of the agricultural advisors that started out as YouTube content creators, portrayed themselves as agricultural advisors, and have earned the hearts and minds of the internet. And so we are now spending time on YouTube content creation as actual agricultural advisors to bring good quality, substantial evidence that actually benefits farmers. So say what's up to the homies. Let's see here. So here's an interesting question. What would be an ocean meal? Do you mean like a crab meal or something? Um, I don't know that it would lower sodium levels. Typically, a lot of the ocean stuff has high sodium. Um, and this is perfectly fine. ProMix might be fine for starts, and in that context, right? So truth is content among the given context. And so of a seed start, you need a lightweight, porous soil that doesn't bog down. And so in that situation, yeah, it probably is appropriate. So, it needs to be, which is one of the reasons why I like the more cocoa heavy soil, because it does work for seed starts and also works for flowering. So, it's consideration. So, and yeah, so this would be one of the considerations for going fast, and that is the biological considerations. And using the bioassay or the microscope assessment, which is the light microscope methods taught by Dr. Elaine Ingham, which I still stand by the fact is the most accurate assessment of the agricultural process of anything out there. I still stand by that, and until something else comes up to show me differently, I still stand by that. So I would personally disregard anybody that tries to discredit that technique. They're clearly trying to throw shade and don't know what the hell they're talking about. It clearly is the most beneficial analysis technique available to soil-based farmers. And a lot of the reason why people are resistant to Dr. Elaine's microscope methods is because there's no denying the reality that you see. And what's really hard for people is they commit to something, or they commit to a stance, or they commit to an advisor or a guru. And then you do the microscope assessment to find out that that stuff is not actually true. So we're at this really weird point in agricultural history where the number of humans capable of doing that microscope analysis is at an all-time high. And the people that are terrified of the information that is coming into agriculture and shedding light onto bad advice, bad cultivation techniques, and bad products is an all-time high. So you've got, we're at the ultimate peak of people capable of bringing this information and people trying their damnedest to stop it. And unfortunately for the people trying to stop it, that's going to age like the dinosaurs. And I think the people that are dead fast on speaking against Dr. Elaine and speaking against those of us that do this microscope, the harder they commit, the more embarrassed they're going to be down the road. You're just not going to win that argument. I'm just telling you now. So what's up, Smiley? Glad to have you here. Always, always. This is kind of an interesting about lighting. Is LED for every strain? I don't think that anything other than LED should be used at this point. I think if you're getting double-endeds or high-pressure lights at this point, you're just not going to be able to be financially viable into the future because of heating and electrical costs. And I know that LED lights are, an incredible cost, but like, on the small scale, you're talking like a 600 watt light. It used to be good goal to get 1 gram, 1.2 grams per watt on a Gavita double-ended. We have people that have literally never grown cannabis before getting over 1.5 gram per watt on some of the other LED lightings. And I mean, that's literally their first harvest ever, getting 50% more yield than we were getting with the Gavita double-ended lights just 5-6 years ago. So I don't know, man. I don't, there's other advantages to LED too. I think with LED lights, you get more control of your environment, whereas with a high pressure sodium, you're only frantically trying to cool it. So I don't know. I'm not a big fan around that. What's up, Kayla guy? Holding strong. Soil Food Web people unite. Soil Food Web people unites. You can still get nice high pressure sodium. I would stand to differ that we've worked with some of the top cultivators on the planet, both hydroponic and living soil, all types of lighting, and you cannot compare the quality that is coming from the newer LED spectrums that are far more developed and far more comprehensive than just like a double-ended that has a vicious spike in the UV spectrum in that blue 720 or whatever it is. I'm not really a lighting guy, but so this is really common. This is going on with Autoflowers as well. The first adopters of our Autoflowers, good luck talking them in that Autoflowers are the future. I'm telling you, Autoflowers will maintain a large component of the future. Not the old Autoflowers, the new Autoflowers. And here we got, LEDs in the beginning, and a lot of people got their ass kicked on those blurples. If you've gone that route, you should try some of these FOS ones. I don't have any affiliation with them or any benefit, but those fuckers are the truth. It's crazy. So lighting is really important. The contextual situation is really important. We were talking about the microscope methods of Dr. Lane, which I will forever stand by as the most accurate assessment of the agricultural process. As early as 2016, we were able to forecast which rooms were most susceptible to powdery mildew, and those parameters have not changed 1% since 2016. And so we did some very large facilities where we stuck to the Dr. Lane light microscope methods of quantifying omycetes versus beneficial fungi, which is what we term those two categories. We're not trying to split the hairs into all the types of omycetes, but undeniably at every single cannabis facility or farm facility or native soil facility or orchard, doesn't matter, any type of soil environment where biology is involved, the relationship between what the Dr. Lane microscope method defines as an omycete, which is a narrow width, irregular side, missing septa, typically clear, goes into the omycete category, and there are 100% undeniable relationships between catastrophic crop loss, epic powdery mildew, russet mites. All these things are overwhelmed in those categories. And we've done a lot of analysis of crop loss in order to bring commercial facilities back into financial viability. And so a lot of our early work was coming to a facility after there was catastrophic crop loss, investigating it like CSI, and coming up with a solution to repair it. And, I take a lot of pride in how well Sarah and I completely eradicate powdery mildew from a cultivation space. And the way that you do it is by using the categories defined by Dr. Lane for what we would call beneficial fungi and the omycetes. And when that omycete value, which is those thin, clear, all those categories, when they go into that category, the relationship of those to what we call the beneficial fungi determines everything about outcome. And you can have a plant on the left and a plant on the right. One is exhibiting mold and one is not exhibiting visible mold. And you can sample those two soils separately. Over almost every single time will be very, very clear line in the difference in relationship between what we define as omycetes and what we define as fungi. And so there's some people advocating that omycetes are fine. And like I said, those advisors can continue to stick to that, but the more that they stick to it and the longer they stick to it, the more embarrassed they're going to be down the road. Because as far as I'm concerned, anybody involved in the soil food web community, in reality, actually doing the work, has known these very clear differentiations between these two families of groups since at least 2015, 2016, undeniable. And so there's those of us that are, going on 5, 6, 7 years of literally millions of square feet of examples of these phenomenons taking place. There's still a few people trying to refute that that's the case. And like I said, the longer they go, the longer they stick to it, the more they're going to be embarrassed. That shit is undeniable. And so using the tools that you have available to you to monitor soil organisms. And that's kind of another weird thing about the living soil community at wide is if you really take a 1,000-foot view and you look at all the people giving it advice and all the people saying things about biological considerations and what happens to biology and how it gets there and what's beneficial for soil communities and how those organisms relate to outcome and yield and pest pressure, most of the people that are speaking on biological matters have never done real quantifiable microscope methods for analyzing soil organisms. And I realize that when I say that, people get offended or they want to think that I'm dividing things into class groups or, positionality. But the reality is, if you're going to speak on biological matters, you would think that having some sort of functional method for analyzing these organisms on generally accepted scientific principles of the scientific community at wide, you would think that that would be important to most people. And what kind of racks my brain is that most of the living soil community and cultivators at wide just allow people to just say random shit. And there's not a lot of requests for accountability from the cultivators. And so my request to you, the cultivator, is to require accountability of those that are saying things to you. And take note in your mind how many people regularly speak on biological matters and they don't have any measurable skill for identifying, analyzing, or quantifying these things. And like I said, we're at a all-time high of people that are capable of providing this analysis because of the work the Soil Food Web School has been doing. And so we are at an all-time high of accessibility of the farmers to use this type of tool. And I would encourage you that if your goal is to work in a living soil environment, to continue disregarding you can't keep disregarding biology. You have to incorporate it into your program. And so this is kind of an interesting one. I think maybe it is a good time to address. And so Wesley Pipe's asking, why is Dr. Elaine so attacked? And it's pure and simple economics, boys and girls. We worked with a farm in 2016 that was 6,000 acres of corn and soy. They brought us on to do biological techniques. And in that first year, you can start to incorporate soil biology and compost extracts. They do have some protozoa in a tank you can buy at the large scale ag, which is kind of trippy. You can get nematodes. So you can start to affect the soil communities from a biological standpoint and get those into the system. And even if you don't fully transition to organics, that first year you cut fertilizer usage in half typically, or you can typically reduce it by at least a third. If you're fully properly doing mineral chemistry and biology, you can definitely cut that in half. And so in 2016, the fertilizers needed to do an acre of corn was about $200. And so the single harvest nutrient input cost of that farm was roughly $1.2 million. And we were able to go to that farm and apply soil food web principles and put them in a position to reduce their fertilizer cost by $600,000 every single year. And if you think that somebody's not going to be interested in that, you have not been paying attention to anything about how the world works. And so what you really need to wrap your mind around as an organic cultivator is there are chemical companies and people with interest in salt-based strategies that are affecting the organic communities as a competition standpoint. And so we've seen situations where we've worked for hydroponic farms that have members of their board on the organic certification for cannabis. And so we worked for a farm in 2018 or 2019, I believe it was, 2019. Anyways, somewhere in that range. Massive hydroponic facility, a lot of money, very respected cultivator. One of their board of directors was actually on the OCal, which is the organic standard regulations for cannabis, and he was on that board, making it more difficult for organic cultivators. And we've worked with literally hundreds of organic farmers. Most of them don't even know that OCal is a thing. None of them are lobbying for their advantage. None of them are keeping track on what's going on, but you have a chemical guy essentially that is lobbying against to make it more difficult for the organics. And so what the organic community is allowing as their biggest detriment is they believe that everybody that is positioned in front of you is for your good and for your friend. And as an insider of the industry, I could tell you exactly who is not your friend and who is not here to help you and who is positioned by the chemical companies to purely to trip you up. If I would communicate these through a platform like YouTube, if you've been paying attention, a couple weeks ago, it got cut off midstream. And so, I don't know. That's just how that shit works. And so the organic community needs to start wrapping their head around the amount of effort and the dollars that are spent simply trying to obstruct and limit the growth of living soil techniques. And you should probably consider that some of the advisors that you think are for your good are very legitimately chemical company employees designed to trip you up. When I first started getting into this living soil stuff, it used to be done on Google on the search engine. And so when you used to type in Dr. Lane, the first hit was a website slandering her about the Klebsiella planticola deal, which you should really investigate. I would say Dr. Lane legitimately saved the planet in a certain aspect, in that one of her graduate students proposed something for the United Nations, and they were going to release a genetically modified organism into the environment. And the research project of one of Dr. Lane's students showed that that would be absolutely catastrophic. They presented it at the United Nations, and by the time Dr. Lane got back to Oregon, she was released from her duties at Oregon State University. I got a magazine. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but there's a tremendous amount of efforts meant to detract from those that are actually making measurable benefit. And so back in Dr. Elaine's years, 2013, 2014, it was done through websites and blogs. Through my era, it's done through Instagram and in YouTube. And so you can see in the comments the people that are perpetually pestering and harassing. I don't know. I would question their actual real employment. And so what you can notice is that those that are always trying to cause doubt, because most people don't pursue, right? And so if somebody puts a little bit of doubt in your mind about Dr. Lane, that's enough to keep you from going down her path. Most people don't continue to do their own research, and they don't dig into it a little bit deeper. They just go, oh yeah, that Elaine's doesn't know what she's talking about. And what's just absolutely mind-blowing to me is Dr. Lane, although she might have, her own human flaws like we all do, she has over like 140 or 150 peer-reviewed journals. And even just this morning, we have a YouTube content creator that has no real measurable agricultural advising experience actually saving farms, trying to attack her methods, saying that they're not valuable. And people believe that. And I think that's just kind of wild about organic cultivators is pretty easy to confuse, and a little bit of discernment is needed and a little bit of deeper understanding as to what's actually going on in the world around you and why people would do certain things. And so, exactly, that's the deal. All you got to do is take a little bit of actual biologically complete compost, hit it with a stick and water, and pour it into your garden and let me know. And, you know, it's undeniable truth, man. It's crazy. But pretty much everything that we've applied of Dr. Elaine's has been solid. The things that I strongly disagree with her is the concept of 100 parts per million of sulfate kills all biology. That's a contextual thing. So, like, if you take a nutrient and you add it to a compost extract and you have 100 parts per million of sulfates in that mix, yeah, it does very readily kill everything in there. And then, but we make very heavy-handed applications of mineral amendments to the soil, and there's no real measurable drop in organisms. And more importantly, what's the context of that? Are you expecting that soil to always have peak organisms despite all of your cultivation-related activities? No. And if you do, then then you need to do more microscope assessment to see how much these things wax and wane. I believe what Dr. Elaine is trying to accomplish with those talking points is she's trying to bring to the awareness that the activities that you do are detrimental to organisms. And so I agree with her on that sense, in that most things that you're doing are killing biology. You should not be worrying about this concept of 100 parts per million of sulfate killing biology. What you need to be doing is inoculating fairly regularly, monitoring your process to see how those trends are happening over time, make the corrections needed to have those numbers elevate to a really desirable level. And then when you do make a heavy application or transplant activity that desiccates the soil, or when you do something that you know is lowering those organism populations, well, you just put them right back. And so for me, we absolutely make all the mineral recommendations and corrections that are needed. I try to use little to no sulfates. We typically only use gypsum, which is calcium sulfate. I really try to not ever use sulfate trace minerals or even potassium sulfate. And so I've eliminated most of those sulfate products from my list anyways. I believe that the sulfates are the only thing that's contributing negative flavor in a real proper living soil system. And so we substitute for other products that taste a little bit better. And yeah, people compartmentalize things, which it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that's how the human mind dissects things. And so if you have very limited understanding of a new subject matter, your brain wants to naturally put it into blocks so you can start disassembling it, and your ancient animal brain creates separation in components and able to discern what they are. But then you need to use your human brain and put them all back together and think of the totality of the situation and what all the factors are that are contributing to this context to determine what content is actually truth. So there you go. Let's see what's going on in the chat. I've been kind of ranting for a bit. Chris out here just bought a microscope. What's up? That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. This is kind of a sidestep question, but yeah, HB nematodes can be added to a bioreactor. I wouldn't bother doing it until the very end when it's cooled down, and they do multiply as long as there's a food source. You can spray nematodes. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but yeah, we have had some hydroponic farms that spray them through their paint sprayers or pest control sprayers, and the nematodes do survive. They're pretty crazy little bastards. So let's see here. Let's see here. So this is a tough one right here. There's a lot of bacterial products available. And what's most important is that you determine that there's actually organisms in there. There's a lot of mycorrhizal products that don't actually have mycospores in there. There's a lot of bacteria products that don't actually have bacteria in there. So the first step is the product I'm buying even viable? Does it even have what I think is in there? We've had really good success with the Tanio products. M5000 is a great leaf applied foliar product. There's another company called BioNatural that makes some nitrogen fixing ones. My preferred one is BioNutri, which is made by Soil Symbiotics, which is sold at our product website, cggdistro.com. That one has twice the bacteria that the M5000 has. It's absolutely phenomenal. Beneficial fungi don't necessarily go into a bottle, and that's the real hangup. In my experience, what we would define as the beneficial fungi come in biologically complete compost. And even to get them in the compost is quite a journey. And it's fairly difficult to get really high numbers of them because the real obstacle to compost making is, and we've worked with a good handful of commercial facilities, and Sarah and I were the first people to produce commercial quantities of biologically complete compost back in 2016 and 2017. And so I got a firm grasp on what it takes to grow beneficial fungi. I've also provided advice for other compost producers in previous years. And we are now coaching commercial facilities outside of our own operation to produce biologically complete compost. We've been doing that in Hawaii with a client for the last year, and we just started up with a client in the tropical islands. And so we're now international biologically complete compost manufacturers, which is pretty cool. And essentially what happens is most commercial producers are after getting the money out the door, right? And so they don't want long-term compost. And when you process material quickly or you combine materials together that breaks down quickly, you will pretty much always end up on that omycete side, those water molds, those powdery mildew causing, disease causing organisms. You will always end up with more of those. And so you have to change everything about your composting process in order to get a different organism. And then on top of that, you have to inoculate them. So when we started our composting facility, we literally went up and down the entire state of California to all of the forest systems, grabbing soil samples to start that inoculation and that mother culture of those piles. And those piles were originally started with Dr. Elaine thermal style that we inoculated bigger windrows, and then the worms continue the inoculation process for you. And that was a 2 to 3 year journey figuring out how to do that very consistently and predictably. So there's not beneficial fungi that come in a bottle. They come on compost material. You can get them out in the forest, but you need to compost them first. There's some advice about grabbing soil from the environment and bubbling it and throwing it straight in. That is a great way to give yourself a crop loss from a fungal pathogen or some sort of disease. If you get anything from the outside environment, you always want to compost it first. So again, I think, you know, I got to be real careful when I say these types of things because people get their panties all in a wad. But one of the biggest issues to having tremendous success in living soil is a lot of the advice is really bad. And what's kind of happened in organics specifically and in the regenerative community is the people that are considered at the top of the advice were simply the people that banged together as bros in the early years of Instagram and got those numbers up. And so for the people that are coming in late and they see these different advisors, like, with all due respect, their advice has not worked for years. And there's kind of like this agreement amongst them to keep supporting up the empire, you know, kind of like you see in Hollywood or something. And so you really kind of want to bypass all that shit, to be real. You know, and I would just strongly advise that, you know, if you're going to come into living soil or you're going to be serious about living soil, you should align with somebody that has gone through Dr. Elaine's school that is quantifying with a microscope to at least track the biology. And then you should also align with somebody that is doing disciplined and diligent mineral chemistry. The other thing that's kind of weird in this organic living soil sector is everybody just wants to wing it. And we've worked with literally hundreds of farmers And there's only been 2 that were winging it that got fairly close to the goal. And I think one of those was almost on accident. The other guy had a system for winging it, and he got the basic ratio of calcium, magnesium, potassium correct in some way without testing, but he was completely missing on sulfur and some other aspects. So what I'm trying to say is 0 of the farmers that we've worked with have been able to maintain soil chemistry from an appropriate balance and maintain those soils long term with just winging it from the hip and just top dressing all willy-nilly some random shit. And so you need to absolutely pay real attention to soil chemistry. You need to come up with a strategy for managing those tests. Some of the living soil advisors use different type of testing. I still stand by that the Malic 3 is the best. That comes from Spectrum Analytical. That comes from Logan Lab. That comes from Kinsey Labs. That comes from Southern Cross University in Australia. There's a couple universities that do the Malic 3, but I'm not super familiar with them. But when we work off of that Malic 3 test, when we also manage the saturated paste test, plain and simple, those results outperform anything else in the industry. And I would say that Nick Tomasini sees the same type of industry leading results that we do. And him and I work very similarly in our managing of mineral chemistry. So I would say he's a good one to align with as well if you're looking for good results. So yeah, that's my kind of rant there. I guess we could get to some questions and get off the rant a little bit. So are living roots needed to maintain biology, or does it depend? Living roots can contribute to biology because you give them a home. The living mulch will also maintain a moisture layer in that top 3 to 4 inches. So that's why we like to use dichondra, because it maintains a little mini ecosystem where the moisture stays in that soil. And then those roots also feed the organisms. If you read the ecological monograph that Dr. Lane put out in 1985, they actually measured very specifically out away from the root itself. And the drop off in organisms away from the actual root hair was absolutely mind blowing. And in the procedures that she teaches us, you're actually, if you see in the soil sample some roots, you're taught to throw a little piece of root in there. And so the living roots do help. They do help maintain biology. In another context is if you've got this single plant with a however big of a root ball it can maintain, and you've gotten this massive soil container that's just dirt, well, none of that dirt is working for you. And so the mulch layer helps that dirt work for you. The cover crop helps that dirt work for you. And then if you inoculate properly, it amplifies everything else that's going in there. So I'm going to go ahead and I've liked Wesley Pipes at this point, but I'm going to disagree with this statement. Malted barley is great for growing omycetes, which are the fuzzy things, which another thing about cannabis is we like to congratulate things that are familiar to us and things that we see often. People that don't have a microscope, they can certainly make fuzzy fungi on the top of the soil surface. 100% of the time in my own personal trials, when I followed the directions given on the internet for getting those fuzzy soil surface, 100% of the time that would lead to undesirable balance of what we would define as beneficial, not as beneficial fungi, or disease-causing detrimental fungi. And in 100% of the gardens that we've provide analysis for, that were doing procedures that were chasing the fuzzy soil surface fungi, also had powdery mildew pressure, also had a disproportionate ratio, and also had ranges from persistent pest and mold issues to catastrophic crop loss. So this is one thing that I've tried to correct since like 2015 to no avail. Maybe someday we will, as a community, understand that those fuzzy fungi are actually what's giving you powdery mildew. If you don't believe me, go to your Instagram, find somebody that's constantly praising those soil surface fuzzy fungi and ask them what their powdery mildew procedure is. Usually they'll excitedly tell you about this really aggressive 2 to 3 times a week strategy to control powdery mildew and how great it is. that person's telling you they have a lot of powdery mildew to control. And so I tend to follow advice of people that don't have any powdery mildew, which is all of the clients that we work with pretty much. So, um, yeah, so, um, yeah. So here's an interesting question about Bacillus thuringiensis to knock down fungus gnats. And what's really interesting about fungus gnats is I believe that they're trying to tell you an indication about the conditions of that soil. And when we do a microscope analysis of a soil that has a gnat problem, it is in the anaerobic range. And those gnats are indicating to you that there is anaerobic decomposition happening on that soil surface, and there are anaerobic bacteria being produced, which is the food source for them and their larvae. So anytime we've seen people try to take a killing strategy for gnats, especially with the Bacillus thuringiensis, so that would be like, I think it's called like Natrol or something, where it has a bacteria in it. When you take a large concentration of one of those bacterial-based products and you add it to a living soil, when you add so much of one thing to the soil at a single time, you end up collapsing that soil food web. So oftentimes people try to kill the gnats with a biocontrol bacteria, and you end up sending it on a direction towards way worse. So I wouldn't personally try to knock down the fungus gnats. I would personally try to figure out what is creating those anaerobic conditions. Is it my behavior? Is it some fermented products I'm using, which I would stop immediate use of all of that? Or is your mulch layer too thick? Is your watering too heavy? When we start to back that watering off and those gnats go down, that's when the numbers on the microscope assessments start to go up. And so there's a relationship between how many gnats you see, how anaerobic your soil is, and how far away you are from a really thriving soil food web. And so it's a real consideration. There's a real consideration to what is my system telling me about um, about uh, about your garden. So yeah, this is exactly what we do. So one of the things that we do, and in the composting course that Sarah teaches, we actually give you a box of our compost to inoculate your compost, and this is what we learned from Dr. Elaine. So you can either use a compost that is termed biologically complete, and be careful, there's only like 3 of us out there that are doing it right now. Maybe a 4th is coming online, but you want to make sure that it is one of the soil food web grads. So there's Catalyst, there's us. There's a guy named Ian that's starting to produce some large quantities with indirectly the Organics Alive guys and their other business partner. So there are some commercially available biologically complete products out there. I take a lot of pride in that we were the first to do it consistently, but I'm glad to see other people are following in step and that the industry is changing, because all of those that heckled our costs on our price are now trying to sell it on their website for the same price. So that's how that goes. In order to inoculate a Johnson Su bioreactor, typically about a gallon Ziploc baggie is plenty. You just want to spread it evenly through that material as you build it, so it's not just in one spot. You want to try and inoculate that entire profile. You can also start with just forest soil. That's how we always started. That's how we learned from Dr. Elaine. And, if you're trying to bring organisms into your garden, the best way to do that is to start with a biologically complete compost, or to go to healthy forest systems if they're near you, or take a drive to them and get some little cores. You don't got to go crazy. I used to go and fill up just a normal Ziploc baggie. You don't need like a truckload or even buckets full. You just need a couple baggies, and go compost those. I think one of the worst ideas to kind of infiltrate itself into the mindscape is that you could just go get forest soil and throw it into a compost tea. Like, that's literally playing with absolute fire. Some people might find good results, but far more catastrophic crop loss scenarios from that type of situation. So you always want to compost it first, either in a small worm bin or in an Elaine style or a bioreactor from Johnson Su or a static pile. But you want to get some soil from a healthy forest system. I know that the IMOs is popular, and I've been outspoken against this technique since it arose. I would say in 100% of the gardens we've worked with that are doing IMOs, you are literally harvesting disease from your environment on rice. And beneficial fungi do not live on rice. You get the disease fungi, you get those clear ones, they get the irregular sidewalls. Those are literally 100% pure shenanigans, and you don't want that in your garden. And I understand that Korean natural farming is really popular right now, and I'm in line with the sentiment and the intention behind it. I believe that in this coronavirus obstacle, we had our own supply chain situations. And for the first time ever, I thought, man, I should probably figure out how to make some nutrients. But I would say in 100% of the gardens that's using IMO, it's a problem. I have not once seen a garden that has followed the IMO process with the rice, IMO 1, 2, 3, whatever you want. At each step of the way, you're making more and more disease. And that is indicated by the results that we've seen since this trend came online and started becoming popularized. And so I'm aligned with the intention of what I think Korean natural farming is about, which is connecting people to natural farming systems. But I'll go on record and say Korean natural farming is and will go down as the catastrophic crop loss champion for all times in organics. We have not seen any other cultivation technique at all cause the catastrophic crop loss, sudden plant death, stem rot, malformed flowers. I mean, it is absolutely unreal the levels of destruction that is coming from the little rice in the box technique. And if KNF has any desire to be fruitful into the future, they need to make a strategy for getting rid of the rice ball deal. Um, Dr. Elaine and I have been trying to educate the community in the world since 2017. And there's been a lot of resistance from that community advocating that rice ball, you are literally harvesting disease from the environment and inoculating your garden. And at every step, when you expand it from IMO 1, IMO 2, IMO 3, you are making more and more disease. And the plant health reflects that. And every single one of my peers that I've tried to assist into the regulated market with Korean natural farming techniques, every single one of them has gone out of business in less than a year. I have not seen something wipe out farmers quite like this. And there's been a lot of really bad advice come through the industry. So far, that one is taking the cake. So when making extracts, do the fungi come through that? Yes. If the fungi are on the parent compost material and you're using a compost extract bag that has 400 micron holes, yeah, they slip right on through and it works quite well. An important consideration for getting those fungi off of the material is not overpacking your bag. And so Sarah and I are both capable of doing the microscope assessment. And in our early consulting work, we would do back-to-back iterations of our process. And then because we both could do the microscope assessment, we would do real-time assessment of those changes. And what we found was the fungi get kind of bound up when you overfill your tea bag and when you're doing that extract. And so in our extract bag, we fill it about 1/3 full and we just do more bags. And so, yeah, the fungi do definitely come through that. They also sink. So they start to stratify, and that's one of the reasons why when people are starting out, we have them do so in a 5-gallon bucket, because that way the stratification is much less and it keeps a tighter knit of variation across that space. And so if you go straight to this massive 200-gallon brewer, that variation of organisms that are stratifying because of their weight and their density in water, you start to have organism distribution get uneven across your property. And when we were brought in to analyze a farm, usually the beds or the sections that had pest problems, when we would analyze that soil, it was always very low in organisms. And so it was either the furthest away from where they started or directly under a dehumidifier or something else that was causing or impacting the establishment of organisms. And so the organisms will separate. And that's why we do the nematodes in a little 8-ounce wash bottle instead of putting them into the tea brewer, because The nematodes have a density that's much greater than water, and they sink all the way to the bottom immediately. And so the nematodes either go to the first place you started or they go to the last place you started. So there's some considerations about the size of the organisms, the weight of them, and how they start to separate in the water. The bacteria seem to always float to the top. So you can put some barley in the worm bin. There's some enzymes and there's some benefits, but as with most Clackamas Coots advice, it needs to be cut in half by like 1/5 or 1/10. They're way too heavy on the applications in his advice. So yeah, you can certainly put some in the worm bin, just do so very sparingly. And if you're starting to see the wispy fuzzies, you're way, way, way too far. So, and thank you for appreciating. We get a lot of there's a lot of resistance to a show like this, and the other one got cut off. From things I was saying, which I probably broke a couple rules, but I appreciate that you appreciate that I'm going through the effort. Roly-polies are starting to be kind of a pain in the ass, and they do tend to nibble on young plants and clones. Sometimes they come through on the compost. We started removing them from our compost before we ship it out. And some gardens, they don't mess with the plants, and they're just a little wood shredder, so they would be good for organic matter and mulch layer decomposition. And so in that case, they're beneficial for the ecosystem, but for some reason in some gardens, they tend to attack the plants periodically. I think it has something to do with running high VPD numbers, which was something I meant to talk about that I didn't get to yet. So maybe that's a good thing to talk about with context for environmental considerations. So if you are in a hydroponic environment, yes, you must monitor the VPD chart, and it is beneficial to adhere to that chart we're all familiar with hitting the ideal ranges. In 100% of the living soil gardens we've worked with, when humidity gets above 60%, you start to have problems with organism communities and the balance of those oomycetes to beneficial fungi in the soil. And you start to have mold and mite pressure. When humidity is higher, it also stifles the biology for some reason indoors, and you won't get those really high establishment and strong numbers until that humidity drops. So the context of environment is really important. My advice to people is always keep it between 50 to 60% humidity and then match the temperature best you can on the VPD chart. But I promise you that by falling off of the VPD chart and keeping it under 60% and allowing those beneficial fungi to establish and allowing those organism communities to elevate, it always outperforms the results you think you're getting in the VPD. And so what happens is during the vegetative stage in living soil running VPD, you will have lush, green, vigorous growth. And that's because there's an abundance of nitrate nitrogen being produced by those anaerobic organisms. But when you move into flower, that's the wrong form of nitrogen, and you start to have powdery mildew pressure. So, yeah, see, Smiley's been there. So, so, um, So, what would the hazards be of using cold fermented fish oils as fungal foods in terms of KNF? In the terms of just fungal foods in general, fish oils are fantastic. In the situation of fish hydrolysate, that does contribute a significant amount of exchangeable hydrogen, which which uh, which causes problems point blank. And a lot of the farmers that have to throw their soil out, it's from elevated exchangeable hydrogen. So the first consideration is not over applying marine-based life. As far as terms of KNF, the major objections that I have to KNF, and this isn't an emotional response, this is based off of many, many, many replicated data sets working with farmers following these techniques, is I can't get on board with anything with all the sugar. To my understanding, the Jadam started moving to more water-based ferments, and I think that was a good switch. But when organic matter or fish material or plant material is decomposed in the absence of oxygen, toxic compounds are produced that are not beneficial to obligate aerobic plants, which if you're growing cannabis, that would be in the category of obligate aerobe, meaning it requires oxygen-rich organisms to perform its functions. And so when you decompose plant material or fish material in the absence of oxygen, you are relying on the organisms that break down environments, not build up higher level plants. And so during that process, the organisms that do that decomposing or breaking down are producing a tremendous amount of toxic compounds. And this is represented in the plant health decrease when these products are applied to your plant. And so my major objection to doing a, traditional KNF ferment is that you're creating your own nutrient, which is great, I'm on board with, but you also produced a tremendous amount of toxic compounds that kill plant roots, a lot of alcohols. It's just a hot mess. And so we use products that are made in a fermentation process. So Provita, Kelpzyme, Keystone, these are extremely high quality, top of the tier agricultural products. They are made in a fermentation process, but it's controlled. It takes 30 days. It's very monitored, and then it's sterilized after so that there's no organisms in there. And then the organisms that are introduced in there to do the decomposition are very stringently controlled, and so that they know what that outcome is. And so in that situation, I'm all about fermented products. The Provita, the Kelpzyme, the Keystone, all made in a biological digestion process that takes about 30 days. The Organics Alive soluble powders, they are also made in a plant-based fermented process in a controlled environment with controlled phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen solubilizing organisms, and then they're sterilized. That's the key. And so I would say compost the fish, top dress the compost into your garden. So yeah. And Wesley Pipes, welcome to the club. A lot of people are in that club. We appreciate you being honest. The weird thing about humans and organic farmers in general is nobody wants to be the one to say, I struggled with it. And what really is the biggest detriment to organics and living soil, particularly in this regenerative community, is that the advice isn't coming from a very helpful or substantiated or really what I would define as correct place. And so this environment, this information is propped up by Instagram and YouTube content creators and the like really good community aspect of living soil. But it crop loss king, y'all. The most crop loss inducing thing I've ever seen. And what happens is once something becomes popular, nobody wants to be the one to say that they did not have success with it, because then you're the one dick in the corner. And the reality is we're all dicks in the corner failing, quietly struggling. And that's what my job deals with, is working directly with those people that are going through those problems. And it's just, at some point, we all got to realize that if something's not working, we need an ability and a forum to communicate these things. And so I'm communicating them publicly to you. I guarantee I'm going to get a couple phone calls tomorrow. I guarantee I'm going to get a couple shitty emails. I would bet $150 that over the next 10 days, at least 2 Instagram accounts are going to slander the fuck out of my name. And that's just how this works. And so at some point, somebody's got to stand up and say, this shit is tomfoolery. And so moving on to overwatering. This is an extremely important part. And what happens when you start to overwater? And this is a real big contention point for most farmers, because the water volume needed for living soil is significantly different than any other technique. When we go to a commercial facility that's been doing drain to waste cocoa, and we switch them in the same exact container size to a living soil and inoculate with biology, within 2 weeks, the appropriate water volume for that space is 1/7 of what it originally was. And so if you're a farmer that's coming from a cocoa-based strategy and you move into living soil, even getting those farmers to cut their watering volume in half takes typically 1 to 1.5 harvest cycles before they believe that they need to give significantly less. Typically, it takes about 2 harvests to get them to about 25% of the water volume that they originally did. And then by that point, they either continue on with the path or they kind of stay there. But when we are able to actually steer the farm on watering volumes based on the microscope assessment, it ends up being about 1/5 to 1/7 the volume needed for other soil-based cultivation strategies, whether that's ProMix or Fox Farms, drain to waste, Coco Core, whatever. It's typically 1/5 to 1/7 the watering volume is needed by that system when it's properly inoculated, and we are governing water volumes based on what the microscope assessment is telling us. And so excess water to microbiological communities is significantly different than our understanding of what watering needs are there. And so what happens is oxygen does not exist in the presence of water for very long. And so as soon as that pot gets filled up with water, it pushes out the oxygen. So in the context of Coco Core, that is how you get oxygen into the root zone, right? So truth is content within the appropriate context. So in Coco Core drain to waste scenarios, you oxygenate the root zone by fully saturating it, which pushes out all the old stale air. And then as that water dries up and is used up, it actually pulls oxygen into the root zone. So the truth of that context is heavy dryback cycles and full saturations is what creates oxygen in the root zone. In the case of living soil, adding the water does push out the stale water, but it doesn't evaporate to such the degree that it pulls water back in. And what starts to pull oxygen back in, rather, not water, but oxygen back in, is the fungi that create pore space. And so in order to have high levels of what we would term beneficial fungi, you need to have an appropriate amount of water for their survival, but not so much that it detriments them. And when that soil is fully saturated with water, you're actually suffocating it. And so from the moment you hit the condition of dropping down in parts per million of oxygen, those organisms immediately respond to it and they form a cyst. They go into a protective layer and they go into a protective stage because to them, they're preparing for a flood and it becomes species survival, which kind of translates into the same concept of how do we get exceptional growth rates and yields in living soil. And that is almost entirely to do with managing water, because in order to have those prolific growth rates that rival or exceed rock wool tables or undercurrent systems, you have to have what we would define as 1,000 micrograms of bacteria and 1,000 micrograms of fungi, because it needs that level of nutrient storage, that level of nutrient release, and that level of beneficial fungi to create the pore space to have the oxygen in the root zone. And so when I was doing Dutch buckets, you could just lift up and look at the roots and see that they're white or brown or look good or look bad. In a rock wool, you can pick it up or you can split the side of the Hugo block or whatever, and you can look visibly at those roots. In living soil, you can't pull the plant up. You can't examine root health. And I think if people could examine root health, they would be more readily and quickly and more open to changing their watering techniques, because they would clearly see indications that their root health was not ideal based on prior experience. So the way that we adapt those principles is by using the microscope methods. We know the levels of oxygen concentration the different organisms live in. And so the ciliates and the omycetes, they operate into very quantifiable, very specific ranges that have been documented by science. It's not my decision. This is other scientists that have come up with this. And we know that when certain populations are there, we're operating within a certain range of dissolved oxygen in the root zone. And so that's where it gets a little bit comfortable. And thank you. I appreciate, we deal with a lot of crazy shit. So it is good to see people really appreciating what we've seen. So thanks to you, Sean. I appreciate. And Preston, thank you as well. Yeah, so the True Living Soil book it was great for the time, but now we need a new book. You know what I mean? Like we need a new book that incorporates the most up to date, accurate information of the understanding of what is currently possible. So maybe we can talk Sarah into writing a book. I will say I don't want to completely shit on Coot. There are some good aspects, and I think he was a necessary transition to people moving into this high performance. But I've been at commercial farms where he's flat out cussed out people. And, I have a hard time having respect for anybody that would cut the legs out of his cultivators during an investor meeting when he's simply trying to carry on their torch. So I lost all respect for that man after a few of those situations. Nobody likes getting cussed out in front of their boss. So let's see. Yep, Smiley Garden. We will have a 12-step meeting on how not to kill your soil biology next week. So coming soon. Well, actually not next week, but yep, it's fake news. It's all fake news. I don't know. I'm not sure what this means. 5 to 10% rule. Is that that's probably for water volume? I would assume. Go ahead and drop in the chat. There's a little bit of delay. I'll give it time to develop, but I think what that means is 5 to 10% water saturation, and I think that on a general sense, the 5% rule is a good general idea of how much water is needed to saturate that, and so I think it's a fairly accurate fairly accurate assessment of how much water actually saturates that media. So I do use the rough 5 to 10% rule when generally calculating out how much it should take to bring up a bed and to give people the basic starting point, because knowing how much water to give a soil is really overwhelming, and a 4x8 bed can just suck and suck and suck and suck down water. And the 5% rule I think is a good general idea to know what that soil can hold. Now, if you're giving that 5% every time, you're way overwatering, I promise you that. And so typically what I would say is in the first, like if you're starting with a brand new soil, yeah, start with that 5% rule and know that it's going to take that much water over the next 3 to 4 days to fully hydrate that pot. And then you need to find a way to break out that 5% volume across the week. And so really the best way to navigate that is to give light volumes of water frequently, if not every day, every other day. And then typically it takes 2 to 3 deeper waterings throughout the week. And so in that first week, you're bringing it up to moisture with roughly 5 to 10% of its volume in gallons of water, and and then maintain a smaller bit of that over time. And then you do need to still deeply saturate, and that's what really gets people confused, because from a biological standpoint, applying small amounts of moisture to the top 4 inches is most ideal, but then we're still trying to raise a crop, and that's not most ideal for that. So you still need to fully hydrate your media periodically, but I would say maybe that first few days put 5% water in there, but then maybe take that 5% volume and spread it out over a week as your moisture maintenance, and then figure out what 1 to 2 deeper waterings per week will do for you. And then the way that you determine what that volume is and when you've gone too far is if you start to see fungus gnats. Everybody wants to use a moisture meter, and that gets really tricky. Every single moisture meter that I've used will double cross you. So you really want to use other more consistent factors, and those fungus gnats are remarkably consistent from my viewpoint. So we put yellow sticky cards down at the soil surface, typically angled towards the direction you walk, so you can walk down your rows and clearly see it. And that will indicate to you if there's a saturated bed. Not every pot or bed in your cultivation facility will require the same volume of water, and so some of them will be overwatered, And if you have a yellow sticky card in that bed, the gnats will stick to it and they will indicate that. So I hope I answered that question. So this is a tough one. What cocoa companies? Whoops, that was the wrong button there. Sorry, the thing moved on me. There you go. What cocoa and peat brands do you trust for a base mix? And this is tough. So at the small scale, you really have what's available to you. So typically you see like Premier, which is the green and white bag. Then there's, I think it's Sunshine, that's the black and yellow bag. What's most important at the small scale for peat moss is, was it stored outside and has it been raining? And is it full of water and is it all anaerobic? Because then it's going to be producing noxious toxic compounds while it's anaerobic. And so you wouldn't want that. I've found that most of the peat mosses are just fine. It's that for regulated facilities, the heavy metals does vary quite a bit. So some of the peat moss comes from the Baltic regions, some of it comes from the Canadian regions, some of it comes from here, I think. And they all have different levels of heavy metals, and the different mines have different heavy metals. So for the home gardener, that's a little bit less of a concern, but for regulated facility, it's literally everything. Other than that, the peat moss tends to perform the same, in my opinion. Some are a little bit more finely ground, which I prefer to have bigger aggregates when I can. And cocoa coir is a tough one because a lot of the cocoa coir is actually washed with ocean water because it's by the ocean. And so they're not making hundreds of thousands of gallons of RO each day just to wash the cocoa coir. I tend to look for what's called RHP grade, which stands for Royal Holland Products, which Royal Holland Products was the first company to differentiate a quality marker and parameters for quality markers for cocoa coir for the high performance agricultural industry. And so if it's RHP grade, what that means is it's been properly washed to a certain salinity and then it's been buffered with calcium nitrate. And so because it's been buffered with calcium nitrate, it's now not available as an organic product. 100% of the time, I would take an RHP non-organic cocoa over a cocoa that has been washed with salt water. I would take it every single day of the week. I don't think that buffering with calcium nitrate is a problem. I think it helps you. And the RHP grade is designed for cultivators that have high value crops where they can't be dealing with unbuffered cocoa coir, because when you do an analysis of cocoa coir on a Malic 3 base saturation, it might have like 40 to 50% base saturation calcium. It might be 20 to 30% magnesium. It might be 12 to 18% potassium. And so they're literally buffering it with calcium nitrate to correct those base saturation ratios to make them more appropriate as a substrate and what soil would be. And so that's an advantage in my opinion. We have used all different types. For cocoa coir, I prefer the long fiber shred. There's a couple companies that make that. Conobo is one. I don't know how you say it, but that's one we used for an entire year. It worked well. It was always really low in salinity. There's a couple other companies that make that same type of long fiber with little shreds in it. I prefer that one personally. It doesn't blend as well in the soil making facility, and so sometimes you get dry spots that you have to deal with. But that, I think, has been a nice product. What's most important with the cocoa coir is that you get one that's got low salinity. So the way that I deal with that when I'm making soil is I take a mason jar to the facility that has the raw ingredients, and I put roughly 2 cups of water I put roughly 2 cups of RO water in there. And then I go to the facility with a 1 cup measuring cup and I take 1 cup of cocoa and I put it into the mason jar. I shake the piss out of it and then I set it in the truck while I'm talking to the guy and grabbing all my materials and samples of everything else. And then I'll put my pH pen in there and measure, EC and ppms. And typically on that real quick shake wash, if it's below 600 to 800 parts per million, it's typically suitable. If it's over 800 parts per million, I don't even consider it, because one of the major killers in living soil is sodium. And so if you start out with too much sodium from a low quality cocoa, you're going to be fighting it from the beginning. And then as far as a regulated facility, I test it. I personally test it. and I test every batch. So every time I'm making 100 cubic yards or whatever for a client, I'll go test the exact batch they have. I have them set it off to the side to me so I know I'm getting the same shit. And I test it for heavy metals. Predominantly, they're going to come from the Baltic regions. They're going to come from the Canadian regions. Over the last couple of years, I've had better luck with the Baltic regions. I think it's also a little bit more affordable. Some of the Canadian stuff is low in heavy metals. Some is the highest of all of them. So you really just got to test, honestly. So, and no, I don't use the Blue Mat moisture meter. I use it as an indicator for a target because people want to know about the Blue Mat moisture meter. I think it's good to have one. I think it's good to try it for a couple weeks, but 100% of the time, a farmer starts using that meter, double crosses them. I mean, it's been the most predictable thing in all of cultivation that that meter is gonna double cross you. And so the other obstacle that I have with it is when you push it in, that thing's like a damn inch round and you're constantly compacting your soil. And so if you're always putting that meter back into the same region and you're constantly compacting that soil, you're changing the density of that soil. And changing the density of that soil changes the the tension measurement of the moisture around that. So if you're going to use a tensiometer style meter, which what that is you really need to leave it be. The problem with the Blue Mat meter one is it runs out of water and the ceramic tip dries out and then the number isn't worth a shit. So I found the only way to even use that meter functionally is you need to store it in a glass of water. So literally just store it in a glass of water so that the ceramic tip always stays hydrated. And then you need to keep it full of water. And then every week or two, you need to reset the cap. So you take the cap off, you hold down the button, you get 3 little lines, and then you screw it back on. And then you put it back in water and it should read 0. If you put your meter back in pure water and it doesn't read 0, your meter is not calibrated or it's broken. And most of them wander. I think it was a valuable tool in my earlier stages of development so I could understand what target to aim for and what to advise people. So when your meter is operating properly and you have it calibrated properly and you've left it set in position for an hour or more, it should be somewhere between 100 to 120 millibars. I prefer personally to run it a little bit drier at like the 120 millibars so that it leaves me room to add additional fertility. And in that case, you're going to need that extra space of dryness. But 100% of the time, what happens with the Blue Mat meter is people put it in place and they try to leave it there for too long, somewhere between 10 and 14 days, because it's not an actual carrot where a carrot is filled with water and it has a dripper that's hydrating the area around it. There's nothing hydrating the area around the ceramic tip of the moisture meter. And so the soil sucks the moisture out of the carrot or the meter, and then the water volume drops and then it doesn't read correctly. That's the first thing that happens. So I think it's good to start out with it and test it in and find out. And so, yeah, I'm still diehard Blue Mats. I just have seen so many people screw themselves up. And what's funny is people will hire me as a consultant and they'll get the Blue Mats and I'll tell them exactly what I told you now. They'll still try to run their entire life with that meter, and 100% of the time it screws them over. So some people are starting to use the other tensiometer that they sell, and I think it's a better quality unit, but it still has all the obstacles of a tensiometer in that you're putting a big plug. It needs to not be jostled. It needs to be maintained. You gotta, it's like I would much rather use a Blue Lab pulse meter. So I tend to put a Blue Mat meter in one time, calibrate my pulse meter, Blue Lab pulse meter, and then I just run with the Blue Mat pulse meter. So Apra is a good one. One of the farms we work with uses Apra. I never heard of it until they got that one. It seems like a high quality unit. I prefer Hannah. No, I'll dig up the number and drop it. Let me see. I'll just do it right here. Let's see. Hannah pH tester. Let me see if I can dig it up. Here it is. This is the one I like. So let's go to this Chrome. me see if I can throw this up. Whoa. Holy shit. Hold on. What's going on? There we go. So this is the one I prefer. This one is pretty bulletproof. It's lasted forever. As long as you keep the storage solution on there, it works really well. What I like about it is it's got those little dials on there. So the calibration is just a slight turning of the knob, and it gives you your pH, your salinity, and your parts per million. So that would be my favorite. I guess that's the, what is that, H19813-5, and they do have like 3 or 4 that look just like it. They probably have, there's another couple that are just like this. There's a blue one now. There's, I think there's even a pink one. But that's been the old trusty rusty since 2010. I've had mine for about 5 years now. And as long as you use the storage solution and keep it filled up and replace the storage solution, so don't store it in RO water, you need to store it in an electrolyte, and go from there. Yeah, I've been trying to tell you for months, fam. You're going to drive yourself mad with that thing. So, know what I'm saying? Oh shit, we got Tyrone in the house? Tyrone, what is up, homeboy? Good to see you following along. Tyrone belongs to a farm that was 25 years of respected hydroponics in Southern California, and now they're producing some of the best living soil extracts because the man Tyrone has been getting it down. So, what's up, T-Bone? Say what's up to the family. Yeah, tools of the trade are important. I need to get around to do a tools of the trade. One of the ideas I had for this channel was literally called Professional Tools. It's just been crazy busy spring. We're in the process of moving, and so there's a lot going on right now. But yeah, I do have intentions to go over tools and professional skills. I think that's important for everybody to know. I also do have intentions for some Blue Map videos. Again, there's just so much going on right now. We've been doing the master classes, which requires a lot of videos, and I've been up to my neck in video making. So I've been pretty full up. So unless we got some other couple things, looks like we've been going fairly long today. We're almost 2 hours. Used up about 45 minutes of ranting for the homeboys and homegirls out there. It doesn't look like they've cut us off the internet, which is cool. Looks like we're still streaming despite our comments about how the chemical company is obstructing your organic progress. So we'll see if this one gets flagged and you have to sign in too. So I guess with that, so yeah, right on. Heck yeah. Yeah, good times. So one of my favorite things is watching people on their journey, and you can take a hydroponic farmer that's been respected in their craft for 10, 20, 30 years, and on their first living soil run done properly will outperform anything they've ever done. And we've done this time and time again. 100% of the time on that first harvest, when everything is done correctly, the quality, the flavors, the smokability, the frost, the cleanliness of that product, 100% of the time, that is improved on the very first living soil run of any level of quality of cultivator prior to that with their experience when they do all the steps properly. The thing that takes a little bit time to develop is the yield. You don't typically outperform the yield of your hydroponic in that first couple, 2 or 3, and mostly that's to do with all the bad habits, or I don't want to say bad habits, all the things that were essential for good outcome in hydroponics are very directly problematic in living soil. So how you water, volumes of watering. Usually it takes a couple harvests for people to realize that their IPM choices are hindering their results. And so the yield typically comes down the road, and the amount of time it takes to meet or exceed those yields in living soil is determined by how well that farmer is able to embrace the needs of the biological system, hands down, plain and simple. And so, um, so yeah, there's that. Yeah, man, it is so hard. And, I'm trying to be careful of just like shitting on people, but like the entire industry is propped up by fake shit. And that fake shit is propped up by ego. And so you have advisors or, respected bros in the industry, and it's literally this like bro code of people holding each other up and calling each other legends when most of them are not legends. And so you have like these weird situations where somebody is giving advice online that is not even farming at home, and they're considered an authority. And then on the other side, there's levels of success, right? So if somebody came from struggling with salts and they moved into living soil and had an improvement in quality, that's now discerned in their mind as the pinnacle of success. And so what they're doing brought about that level of success. But there's, in my opinion, at least 100 levels of success above what the living soil community is doing it wide while following the generally accepted available information. And so I was just talking with somebody today about this, is that the reason why the person on the other end of this stream has such a hard time is because when people like me are sharing stuff, I can promise you 100% of the time they're withholding an aspect of that context, which makes that content truth. And so without knowing the full context of what somebody is doing, it's hard to take the little bit that they gave you, apply just the little bit that they gave you, and have those same levels of success. And so, because of my position in the industry, that we see things from the inside out, I know pretty pretty in depth what everybody is doing in advising, and oftentimes what the advisors are doing in their own gardens. And so, there's a lack of transparency, and then even some of the farms that are doing living soil, the things that they say, they don't want to help you, so there's several living soil farms that are aiming to be inspirational, and they're very literally trying to trip you up. And so navigating who those farms are is very difficult. If I come on here and tell you who they are, it's just the backlash is not worth me trying to communicate that to you. And so these are the obstacles for the cultivator to navigate, and that is very difficult. And I don't want to say that I'm the only solution. Obviously, I'm proud of what I'm doing, and I would define our results as industry leading, and that's by very direct metric measurements. That's not an opinion, that's mathematical quantifiable things. And I would say Nick Tomasini gets the same industry level results. And so, if maybe you don't care for me, I would hit up Nick. I'd feel like you can trust anything that he says. He fulfills a similar role in the industry where he's working intimately behind the scenes. He does a lot of cleanup of complete disasters like we do. And so we have a very firm grasp on what the different advisors are doing, what their advice is doing to the market. And so, the obstacle for me is I just can't come on here and put people on blast. That just never really is worth it. I'm already walking a tight line today. I'm probably going to be booed off Instagram all next week, like I could give a shit. But nonetheless, that's what you got to do. So, yeah, man, just to bring it all back full circle, the way that you discern what information is trying to help you and what information is not helping you is by taking data sets. So the way that I discern almost immediately if somebody knows what they're talking about is I put it to the microscope test. And for those of you that want to be Soil Food Web advisors, or those of you that have gone through Dr. Lane's courses, that's what Sarah and I did. Sarah and I set up test gardens where we literally from top to bottom ran the advice of the predominant narratives at the time and put a microscope to it, found out the strengths of it, found out the weaknesses of it, and prepared ourselves to advise farmers when they came to us with those trends. And so you have to stay up on trends and you have to work it out. And so for us, we're capable of doing those microscope assessments. So it's easier. We got 6 damn microscopes in this office. It's very easy for us to do that. And so that's a tool that's available to us. As a farmer, you should do at least 3 to 4 microscope analysis of your cultivation cycle at least once in your life. And there's a lot of people right now that are capable of doing this math, and they're putting themselves out there on different social media outlets. Line up with one of those people, you know. When I started doing this, before I started charging for my services, I did an entire year of free samples for anybody that would send them to me. I learned a lot about the trends, the advice, the industry at wide, what the farmer was struggling with. It became very clear to me, upside down and inside out, what was beneficial and what was not. And so putting a microscope to anything with related to soil, you're going to need to know what the biology is doing. And so if someone is giving you advice on tea brewing or IMO collection or whatever, within an hour you can discern if that information is helpful, correct, or incorrect. And on the same side with the mineral chemistry, it's just as important. And so, you know, there's several people now that are doing mineral recommendations. There's some that I slightly disagree with their strategies and their advice. I think some of the advice is very hurtful right now. But again, Nick Tomasini's good. A lot of people are using the Soil Doctor, which I think he's at a good point. I just think he has a lot of evolution to go through, especially if he's going to be working in the living soil. He should start familiarizing with how his advice negatively impacts soil communities and how that's limiting his results. But you know, clearly knows the math and can help navigate you through some of those things. And so the way you discern what the path forward is by taking measurable data points of your process to the degree of your budget. And I know if you're a small grower, people object to soil tests and water tests, but even if you're running one single light, I promise you that you will get the yield back on the soil tests and the recommendations if you follow that advice. You will get that, I promise you. I don't know that I've had a situation where there was not a positive impact on yield and a recovery of that economic cost for that testing. It always provides the benefit. And so you just need to get on a rhythm and you need to find a way to budget that into the process. So there you go. And I think we'll end on that. We're getting about 2 hours. I've said way too much already. Pissed off the entire internet, probably, but whatever. We will be doing a whole thing on this. Give me a week or two. I will go through all of the things. We've already kind of started building it. Some of those microscopes we have here. The best affordable microscope depends on what your context is. Are you going to be carrying it around with you? Or are you trying to be a soil food web advisor? Are you trying to travel with it? Is it going to sit on one desk and never be moved? That will determine what microscopes you choose. So we will make a specific episode for that. Give me about 2 weeks and we will put that together. But it is on the whiteboard. And so, right on. So, I guess let me do this one. This one went and I passed it. I missed it and it came up again. So I want to address it. So, as a base soil mix, yeah, exactly. Quality compost is going to be hard to find. It is there though. I've done this work for people in Arizona and Colorado and kind of a little bit further east from California. And there are a couple of facilities in Arizona that are halfway decent. You can even use clean municipal compost. You just need to go through the process of evaluating it for your process, which is the difficult part. And so in the case of large volumes, it gets very difficult to go to a soil blending facility and say, hey, I would like to make some soil. I want to sample this compost and I need to have it sit here and don't sell it because I want this batch that I tested. That's very difficult to pull off. And so navigating that is a whole 2-hour discussion on its own. And essentially, you don't need biocomplete compost as the base. You need clean compost that doesn't have excessive levels of potassium, sodium, and magnesium. Again, so you test it. You just have to do the preliminary testing. If you're doing the smaller scale, then you just got to go gather the local materials that you have, form them into a mock mix, which we have a video on the channel about how to do, and you send that in and see what the range is. And we've used municipal compost. It just needs to be non-toxic from a sodium standpoint. It needs to not have excessive potassium, and then it needs to blend with your other materials as well. And so, you know, that's a tough one for sure. So we'll have to make a whole episode about that. In the meantime, watch the video on making a mock mix. I'm still kind of figuring out the YouTube, so I'm not cool enough to make it like pop up in the corner or what people do. I'm still a novice in my YouTube content creator journey, but maybe YouTube will recommend it and it'll just kind of work out because it's monitoring my words and the algorithm is trying to satisfy your needs. So I think with that, I've said too much and we're going to cut out. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for staying in this long if you managed to the end. And we'll see you not next week, but the following week.